EDL 853, Module 3, Special Education Interviews. First of all, I want to introduce you to the three wonderful staff members that I interviewed for this project. First of all, you have Mrs. Collins, elementary principal. She's also a former special education teacher. Had no idea that she was prior to asking her to be involved in this module, so it's pretty cool. Then you have Mrs. Brock, high school special education teacher, and then Mrs. Rail, the high school special education paraprofessional. So when it came to child find procedures, there was a lot of initial uncertainty, and this is likely due to the fact that special education technically starts from birth to 3 years of age, and a public school doesn't have a whole lot to do with a child prior to them being in pre-K program. And additionally, a lot of these kids are identified through multiple people that aren't associated with the school, such as doctors, pediatricians, parents, social workers, and so it's not guaranteed that it's someone associated with the school that identifies the student as needing services. I did find it really interesting. Mrs. Collins talked about the Link Grant and the Babel Talk Read website, and it's like an app, and she's able to communicate with parents who have children that will be students in a couple of years of Central Heights. She's really excited about it and showed, kind of how the app worked, and you can see developmental benchmarks that your child should be at throughout the 0 or the birth to 3 age. So I thought that was really cool and pretty useful, probably for parents that take advantage of that. Mrs. Rail, being a paraprofessional, she had no idea how students are put into or how they're identified. And Mrs. Brock she said she had to look a lot of it up because being a high school special education teacher, a lot of the students are already identified prior to her coming into play for that student. The most challenging part of your role with regards to special education and why, and both the principal and the teacher, so both Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Brock talked about keeping others on board and informed about the kid. They were mostly focused about the planning of the IEPs and the planning of teachers' lessons and modifications. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rail, because she's a paraprofessional who works alongside the student, was more focused on the application of that IEP and the application of those modifications. And so, I kind of found that kind of interesting that the different roles kind of answered the challenging part differently. And so, it kind of found that one to be something that was very clear and distinguishable during this interview. What is the most rewarding part of your job and why? All three of these women had an answer that had to do with student success being their driving force. I think anybody working in a special education department, the ultimate, the student's the main event. Keep the main event the main event, and their success is your success. And Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Rail in particular, both of them, they instantly lit up when that question was asked, and they answered it emphatically with, when a kid is successful or when they get it. I also thought it was really cool that Mrs. Collins talked about that she finds that it's really important to celebrate when a kid goes off an IEP. You don't hear much about that. You hear more about, as a teacher, a general ed teacher, I hear more about kids being put on IEPs rather than kids coming off IEPs. So I thought it was really cool to hear the excitement in her voice when she talked about kids going off of them. Mrs. Brock also talked about building relationships with the kids and being able to know their dreams and their goals and their aspirations. And I thought that was really cool. She does an excellent job of rapport within her classroom and building relationships. The kids absolutely love her, and she's more than just a teacher. I also thought it was really cool. She continued on. I didn't get it put on the slide. She talked about she found it really rewarding to help level the playing field, and that the highest dropout rate is among special education students, and to be able to help with education and to keep that dropout rate from affecting her students is excuse me, something that she takes very, very serious, and it's very rewarding to see students graduate. What advice do you have on supervision of special education staff, including paras and speech pathologists? First of all, scheduling and organization seems to be the main key. Mrs. Collins talked about making that schedule, making sure that people can get or that they're getting what they need on their IEP, that they're not enabling kids to be. Sorry, my dog's walking up here. Not allowing kids to be enabled, but instead be empowered. And thought it was kind of interesting. Mrs. Brock, we talked a lot about knowing her para's strengths and using those strengths. Whether Mrs. Rail talked about how geometry and algebra are not one of her strong suits, and so she is better in a classroom like a history class because that's something that she is good at. And I found that really interesting that they use paras strengths within the classroom. And I kind of always wondered why I had the same para that comes to my classes, and it's tends to be his strong suit is the classes that I teach. I really liked Mrs. Brock's, her answer there at the bottom where she talked about how she has a team meetings to encourage her paras, and that this is a direct quote from her where she said, "I can't do my job without them," and that's a quote that she says to her paras a lot. And so I thought it was really interesting. You have a paraprofessional who kind of the stereotype of the bottom of the totem pole, the underappreciated a lot of times. They're kind of in a thankless position a lot. And here's a professional who gives them the credit that they deserve, and that's really nice to see. I don't think that paraprofessionals get as much credit as they deserve, and it's good to see that the special education teacher treats them well. How do you work effectively with parents of special needs children? First of all, Mrs. Rail, as a paraprofessional, said that she does not communicate with parents at all. And if she does get an email, she refers the email to Mrs. Brock, and if she's told to respond or is advised to respond by Mrs. Brock, then she will, but she doesn't want to do anything that would be a misquote and could lead to legal ramifications for Mrs. Brock or an administrator. So she really has very limited role in the communication side of things. Mrs. Brock had the most to say, and it was probably due to the fact that she has the most control. Not only is Mrs. Rail referring a lot of those questions to Mrs. Brock, but Mrs. Collins said that one of her goals is to let the teacher take the role of the communicator with the parents. And yes, Mrs. Collins attends IEP meetings, and she helps with every step along the way, but she is not the sole communicator. She really leaves that for the teachers to take charge of. How do you work with regular education teachers of special education or special needs students? First of all, administrators. Mrs. Collins talked all about planning and instruction of general education teachers. She talked more about her answer was more inclined toward the supervision side of being the higher up of the general ed teachers, supervising them and making sure that they are trying something and working through any new strategies or ideas that they have. Mrs. Brock very much talked about kind of working alongside the general ed teachers, and she's not above them, but instead equal with them, and trying to make sure that she's supportive and helpful for them. And then Mrs. Rail talked more about working alongside the student, not necessarily alongside the teacher, but alongside the student, and not only serving the student within the regular classroom, but also serving the teacher when it comes to, say, like she used the example of discipline. She said being in the back of the classroom, she sees things that maybe the regular teacher does not get to see. And so she said that my dog is driving me crazy. So She said being in the back of the classroom, she gets to see some things that other people don't get to see, or that the teachers don't get to see, and so she finds out what she would like, what that regular teacher would like her to do with that information, whether she wants them to be corrected or be informed, or whether she wants her to inform the regular education teacher about it. What advice do you have for a first year administrator? Um, Knowledge of special education seems to be key. I really liked Mrs. Rail's response of where she said, "I don't think there's many kids that want anyone to draw attention to the fact that they are special ed, and find a way to keep things discreet." Hadn't really thought about that before, but it makes perfect sense. I think that Mrs. Collins, her third comment there about don't shuffle off responsibility on others, was probably talking in referencing some frustrations that she's had working with other administrators in her career. And Mrs. Brock focused a lot on the procedures and the application and the technical skills of being able to of what a first year teacher would need. How do you describe the role of special education teacher and a building principal? Mrs. Collins is very quick to say that they're not two separate roles, but instead they need to be very close to one another. The other two, Mrs. Brock and Mrs. Rail, talked about communication and working as kind of a unit and as a team. I think that's pretty important and very, very vital. One of the things I did not anticipate was Mrs. Brock's conversation about being a teacher, the fact that a special education teacher is kind of put in a position where they're kind of the first ones, very commonly the first ones to find out about a need for food or a student becoming homeless or parents' loss of employment, and that it's vital that a principal is able to assist in those issues. And see, I had no idea that Mrs. Brock would be the first one to find out about those issues and be able to inform a principal. But I think that's pretty comforting as a future administrator, that you have a teacher who has that kind of relationship with students, and you can have an open communication with that teacher, so that you can be well informed and to be the best administrator you can for your students on any given situation. What characteristics do you seek in aspiring administrators with regards to special education? Mrs. Collins, she once again may have been speaking out of frustration when she talked about not being so focused on technology and just putting technology in their hands. She talked a lot about how technology is not the answer to all of life's needs or problems, and that instead curriculum needs to be built around students' interest and not around them. And the easy thing to do is to throw them onto a computer and have them work through a curriculum. But what students really need is something that applies to them, and being able to be positive and supportive. Mrs. Brock talked a lot about the technical levels, technical skills once again, but they all talked about being flexible and being good planners. Mrs. Brock also talked about being able to read an IEP, being aware of how much time it takes to make a student's IEP. I had no idea the amount of time that it took and the work that it took for the paperwork side of things. So I have a whole new kind of level of appreciation or respect for Mrs. Brock and the special education department through that. And then Mrs. Rail once again gave the perspective from the student's perspective, being that she works most closely along the side of the student within this regular education classroom. It would be natural if she has more of a perspective of what the student really needs, what the student needs, and what impacts them instantly. When she said, "Be patient and be supportive to those students." Thank you.